what's the real difference between regular dunks and SB dunks, or dunks SB? I honestly don't know which way that's supposed to go. We're gonna cut them in half, even though we've cut some of these in half already, just really compare the two and really dive into the inside of these shoes to see what the real difference is, if there is any at all. Because as we've learned, sometimes you just can't trust these big brands' hype and their marketing to really tell you the truth about what's inside the shoes that you spend your hard-earned money on. This video is sponsored by Sole Premise. So you might not know this, but I have a lot of boots and shoes, and traveling with more than one pair on your feet is kind of a nightmare because you got to sacrifice, what am I going to take out in order to fit another pair of boots or shoes? Is it my laptop? Is it more underwear? Is it socks? What am I going to sacrifice? Well, Sole Premise makes bags so you don't have to sacrifice what you pack, especially when it comes to your footwear. Sole Premise makes bags with shoes in mind. I have their signature polyester bag in the green camo. It's really nice because you can fit 4 to 5 shoes in this bag, and if you're like me and you got a big tall pair of boots you're lugging around, it's got this huge bottom pocket that you can fit a nice 8-inch boot on the inside, because nobody's trying to travel in a giant pair of 8-inch logger boots. But it is nice to have them, like if you're going hunting or if you're going to somewhere you're going to need a pair of boots. And if this version isn't big enough, they also have an XL version, so if you have giant feet like my little brother, it fits up to size 16 shoes, and it fits more shoes if you have normal size feet, or like smaller. Let's not make fun of big feet people. And their bags are also TSA approved, so there's no hassle when you're carrying it on the plane and have to deal with security and unpack everything. They're really easy to get through the airport. And it's not just a bag for shoes. You can fit all your other stuff in here. You can pack it up full of shoes, but there's plenty of room for your underwear, your socks, your laptop, all your other clothes. So it is a super versatile bag. And if you want a Sole Premise bag, you can get 40% off, which is a huge discount with the code ROSEANVIL at checkout. And be sure to use the links in my description. And thanks again to Sole Premise for sponsoring this video. So a quick history of the dunks. They originally started out as a basketball shoe, and then kind of got overshadowed by the Jordan 1s and all the other sneakers that soon followed, and they kind of just ended up on the sales rack, which was a perfect place for skaters to pick them up as a cheap alternative to these more expensive skating shoes. And because they had so much board feel, they soon became a favorite for skaters. And then by the mid-90s, skateboarding had really just blown up, and it became a fairly mainstream sport where a lot of people were doing it. So Nike saw that potential, was like, you know what, they're skating our shoes already. Why don't we just make a dedicated skateboard shoe? And so that's when they went to work designing the Dunk, but a skateboard version, the SBs. And then they soon released the SBs, and they've kind of just been a popular skateboarding shoe ever since. In the more recent years, as you guys probably know, they just are super overpriced, and they're hard to get, and they're not even going to the people they were intended for. They're just going to people that want to wear them around and not actually skating them, which is kind of a bummer. But that's kind of the brief history of the SBs and the regular Dunks. So allegedly the SBs are supposed to be a better skateboard shoe, more durable, more board feel, just a little bit more padding, but we don't know if that's true or not. So let's start going through this thing, starting with the leather. So the leather thicknesses between these two shoes. So if we look at the Pandas, the regular Dunks, the thickness of this leather is about 1.4 to 1.5 millimeters thick versus the SBs. And we're gonna talk specifically about the grain leather version first. So this came in at 1.8 millimeters thick, so a little bit thicker, which is great for skateboarding because it gives you a little bit more wear before you start wearing to the inside of the shoe, a little bit more durability, and a little bit more leather to hold your foot where it needs to be before it starts stretching out and wearing out. And then as for how we grade these two shoes, if we put it on the standardized Rose Anvil grading system, the regular Dunks, because they have that really heavy top coating that just kind of melts away when you put it to the flame, and it has that fake print, and it has just a little teeny bit of that grain, this would be considered a C grade leather, which is pretty standard for Nike's leather. The SBs, on the other hand, this leather, it doesn't have quite as heavy of a coating on top, because when we burned it, it didn't quite melt and fizzle and do the same thing that the regular C grade Nike leather did. It more just kind of flakes off, and it's more of a heavy pigment on top rather than a super heavy coating, or rather than a super heavy plastic coating. And it still has that fake print embossed in the top, and it has that little bit of the grain in the leather as well. So to me, it's like right on that edge between a B and a C grade leather, but because it doesn't have that super thick coating on top, I would consider it a B grade leather. So the leather is better on the SBs. It's thicker, it's a higher quality leather, and it doesn't have that cheap plastic coating on top that everyone hates because it just creases like crazy. It wears out, it separates. It's a little bit better than the regular Nike leather. And that's kind of where the Suede SBs come in, because Suede is really known for being some of the more abrasion resistant and wear resistant leather out there, because when you have all these loose fibers, it's a lot harder to sand down loose fibers because they just kind of move as you sand, and it's a lot harder to just remove that layer, versus a really heavy coating of plastic. So a lot of the SBs that people really like for skating, they go for the suede because it is a higher quality leather. And I'm still working on the suede grading system, so eventually I'll have it out. But this leather is just as thick as the other SBs. It's 1.8 millimeters thick. And it's hard to really tell if it has the grain in there or not. If you look really, really closely, it looks like there's just a little bit of the grain that's flipped on the underside. So it is a slightly higher suede than what you see in a lot of cheaper boots or a lot of other cheaper shoes. So at least it's not a cheap suede, which I was actually pretty impressed with for Nike, putting a decent suede on the shoe. And the swoosh is not suede, obviously. And this is a good example of a B grade leather because it has that pattern embossed on the top, but it doesn't have that heavy plastic coating. It's just a pigment coating on top. So when we burned that, it didn't melt. It just burned, which is a sign to me of a higher quality leather because they were able to keep that grain more intact than when they're just covering with a super heavy plastic coating. And then other than the leather quality difference, what else is different between these two shoes? Well, like I said, there's a lot more padding in the SBs. You got a lot puffier tongue, like the classic 90s skating shoes. More padding in the heel, and they have a little cup for your ankle bones that the regulars do not have. And allegedly there's less foam through the midsole because when you're skateboarding, you want to be able to feel the board underneath your foot. And one of the biggest things that people always point to is the difference in the insoles. If I can pull one of these out. The insoles are completely different, and I think an important part of the difference between these two shoes, because they're two completely different qualities of foam. You know, the regulars just have a really cheap foam versus the SBs have a little bit more of like a memory foam feel at the ball of your foot and a pretty dense closed cell foam throughout the rest of it. And most importantly, they got the Zoom Air at the heel. And the Zoom Air is essentially just an air unit with a lattice structure fabric on the inside. And we'll go over this more in the Jordan 36 video because it has a lot of that in there and it's a better place to explain it. But the idea behind this is because you take so much impact when you're skateboarding at your heels and the ball of your feet, they added these two features to help cushion the fall when you're dropping down a set of stairs, whatever you happen to be doing. And one question we had was, is the Zoom Air, does it actually have air in it, or is it just a gimmick, and do they actually break and do they pop? So the first thing we did was we did a quick puncture test with our pressure gauge, and it definitely does have pressure in it. And it read at 5 PSI, but I think it's a little bit higher because when we're just pushing it straight into an air unit, a lot of the air escapes before we get the needle all the way through. So it definitely does have some pressure in it. And then to test to see how responsive this is and to see if we get it to pop, we did a quick bar drop test on the insoles only. And as you can see, you know, it does perform slightly better, and more importantly, it didn't pop the air unit, which was really surprising, or it didn't pop the Zoom Air, which was really surprising to me, because that bar, I think it weighs like 35 pounds, and we dropped it from like 3 feet in the air. So I was actually quite impressed with the Zoom Air pad at the heel. And when you're wearing these shoes, I don't know if it's just in your mind that you can actually feel that difference, but I feel like you can feel that rebound and that squishiness at your heel in the SBs. So from that, it tells me that this is a better insole, and it is worth, maybe even this just alone is worth the $10 extra to get a better insole. And we also wanted to test the shoes themselves on the bar drop test, and as you can see, they performed about the same. You know, there's not a huge difference between the two, and it might be because they have about the same amount of foam in the heel. But before we cut it in half, we wanted to really see how well these different leathers perform on grip tape. So we just got a skateboard, and the way we did this is we basically dragged the shoe on top of the skateboard on that grip tape to see how it looked after 25, 50, and 100 scrapes on the board. And as you can see, the regulars, they wore out quite a bit. And even like the rubber, it seems like it wore out more than the other two, versus when you look at these SBs with the suede, you can't hardly tell where they sanded it. And then part of that might be a different rubber compound, but also on the toe where it's hit, you can see where they've worn through the threads, but it's not even remotely sanded down on the leather. And that's because of those loose fibers that have a hard time being removed when you're sanding them. And then if we look at the regular leather SBs, there still is a fair amount of rubber removed, but not nearly as much as the regulars, and not as much leather is removed. But I think part of the reason why not as much leather was removed is because the sidewall on the cup sole held up better than the regulars, allowing more protection for this leather. So even a side-by-side comparison, they probably perform about the same. The regulars might sand a little bit more because it has such a heavy plastic coating on top. But really, when it comes down to it, having a few fractions of a millimeter more. Is it going to make that much of a difference when it comes to the abrasion resistance? Probably not. But that was the surprising thing about this test, was the cup sole matters in this shoe, which I did not expect. And more importantly, you can really see now why skaters love suede shoes, because it's really, and even work boots. If you look at the highest quality work boots with the Pacific Northwest brands and Whites and Nicks and all these guys, and they're really heavy work boots. They use like a flesh out, which is essentially suede, because of how abrasion resistant it is. So even before we cut this thing in half, I already feel like it's worth the extra 10 bucks to get the SBs. They're clearly a higher quality leather, a better insole. So now let's cut this thing in half and really see what the construction difference is between these two shoes, because that's allegedly where the biggest difference between these two shoes are, or is. All right, we got all three cut in half, just to double check that the suedes aren't built differently. You never know. So let's start with the regular dunks first. So there is actually a pretty substantial difference between these two. I thought for sure that when we were going to open this up, that we would see the same foam layer that we see in the regular dunks all the way through the SBs. But you can clearly see that the SBs don't have any foam in the forefoot. And you can see even at the heel that the heel doesn't have nearly as much foam on the SBs as the regulars. And that's where a lot of that board feel makes a lot of sense, because if you're standing on top of this much foam, even though it's like a centimeter of foam, it still is not going to give you the same responsiveness, and it's going to absorb some of the feeling and impact underneath your foot. And especially when you're skateboarding, you do some on your heel, some of the maneuvering of the board, but a lot of the board feel comes from the heel forward of your foot. And so to have no foam there makes a ton of sense for a skateboarding shoe. But even down to the outsoles are slightly different thicknesses, and the sidewall itself is slightly thicker. So now going back to our abrasion test, you can see why the regular dunks wore down and started hitting the leather before the SBs. It's because the sidewall's thinner. And now you can really see too the difference in the foam throughout the entire shoe. Look at that, look how thick this tongue is. That's ridiculous. But overall, is the SB a better shoe than the regular dunks? I would say pretty clearly it is. It's got better leather, the thicker outsole. It's specifically for skateboarding. You have a little more padding around your foot, and you have less foam throughout the forefoot, which gives you more board feel. And the insole is significantly better than the regulars. So for $10 more, if you could get these for retail, I would just go every day to the SBs if you're actually going to skate them. So pretty clearly to me, the SBs are far and away a much better shoe, especially for skating. All the features that you need to make the regular dunks a skatable shoe are all there. And so I was actually really surprised, and I'm glad to see that the original idea and the concept of the SB is still around today. Because a lot of times these brands will initially launch these like 10 or 20, 30 years ago, and then over time as they retro them and bring them back, they start dropping more and more features, and then all of a sudden you're left with a shoe that just has a name but without any of the substance. So I'm really glad that the SBs actually have the substance that gave them the SB name. So thank you guys so much for all your support. It's what allows us to actually answer some of these questions that are always debated in comment sections and Reddit, where no one actually has any information. Now we know for sure what you're spending your hard-earned money on, and we can start settling a lot of these debates. And I love doing that. So thank you guys. See ya.